Mechanic LAUGHS. At Elon Musk's Tesla problem. His life changed when he checked the ID. Joe Sullivan's back cracked as he straightened up from under the hood of a beaten-up Honda Civic. Another day, another oil change. The clock on the wall of his Oakland repair shop read 2:17 p.m., and the California summer heat was turning the place into an oven. Even with both garage doors wide open, the air felt thick enough to chew. "Martha, you really gotta stop waiting so long between oil changes," he called out to the elderly woman sitting in his waiting area. She'd been coming to him for 15 years, ever since her husband passed. "Oh, Joe, you know how it is. Fixed income and all that." Martha fanned herself with an old magazine, her gray curls damp with sweat. "Besides, gives me an excuse to come visit you." Joe wiped his hands on the red shop rag that never left his back pocket. The cloth had been white when he bought it, sometime back in 2019. Or was it 2008? The days blurred together. "Tell you what," he said, grabbing his clipboard. "I'll only charge you for the oil this time. Labor's on the house." He'd been doing this more often lately, cutting deals for his regular. The economy was tough on. "You're too good to me, Joe." Tommy would be proud. Joe's hand froze mid-signature. 5 years, and hearing his son's name still felt like a punch to the gut. "Yeah," he managed, his voice rough. "Maybe." The shop phone rang, saving him from the moment. His assistant Mike was out sick today, so Joe had to handle everything himself. He didn't mind. Staying busy kept his mind off things. "Sullivan's Auto Repair," he answered, wedging the phone between his ear and shoulder as he finished Martha's paper. "Hey, Joe, it's Danny from the parts store. Got those brake pads you ordered already? Thought you said it'd be next week." "Got lucky with the shipment. Want me to drop them by?" "Heading your way anyway." Joe glanced at his schedule board. 3 more oil changes, 1 transmission flush, and a brake job. All routine stuff. "Yeah, swing by. The morning crowd had thinned out. After helping Martha into her car, "You call me if it makes any funny noises you hear." Joe took a moment to sit in his office. The small room was barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs, but it was his. 20 years of certificates covered the walls, along with a few faded photos. His eyes caught on the one by his computer. Tommy at his college graduation, holding up his engineering degree from Caltech. The kid had been brilliant, could have worked, but he loved getting his hands dirty, spending weekends in the shop with his old man, figuring out how to make things. The desktop fan hummed, pushing around hot air. Joe should have replaced the shop's AC unit years ago, but something always seemed to come up. Property taxes, insurance, equipment repair. Being a small business owner meant constantly juggling bills, and lately, it felt like he was dropping more balls than he was. A knock on his office door pulled him back to the present. "Come." Rico, one of his regular customers, poked his head in. "Hey, Joe, got time to look at my truck? Making a weird noise when I turn left. Now, if you can, gotta drive to LA tomorrow for work." Joe sighed but nodded. This was how you stayed in business, being there when people needed you. "Pull it in Bay 2. Let me grab my tool." The next few hours passed in a blur of grease, metal, and the constant stream of small talk that came with the job. Joe liked this part, the rhythm of work, the satisfaction of fixing things. Cars made sense. They had rules, patterns. Unlike life, which seemed to enjoy throwing curveballs when you least expect. Around 4:30, Danny showed up with the brake pads. "Man, it's dead out there," he said, looking around the empty shop. "Economy's hitting everyone. Tell me about it." Joe signed for the delivery. "Had to let Mike take some days off. Can't afford full-time help right now. Heard the shop down on Webster closed last month. 3rd one this year." "Pete's place?" "Damn." Joe shook his head. Pete had been in business longer than he had. "What's he doing?" "Moved to Arizona. Said his daughter's out there." They chatted a while longer, sharing the latest neighborhood gossip. That's how it was in this part of Oakland. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew someone who knew. It wasn't the fancy part of the Bay Area, but it was home. After Danny left, Joe tackled the transmission flush. He was elbow deep in the job when he heard tires on concrete. Probably Mr. Chen. He had an appointment at 5 for an oil. "Be with you in a minute," Joe called out, not looking up. The sound of an expensive car door closing made him pause. Mr. Chen drove a '98 Corolla. "Take your..." The voice was familiar, but Joe couldn't place it. He finished what he was doing, wiped his hands, and turned around. His first thought was that the white Tesla Model S looked out of place in his shop, like a thoroughbred in a stable full of workhorses. His second thought was that he knew the man standing next to it, though not personally. Everyone knew that. Elon Musk stood in his shop, looking both annoyed and impatient. Joe blinked. Sure, he was seeing things. The heat must be getting to him. But no, there really was a Tesla parked in his bay, and its famous owner was really standing there in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, looking like any other Silicon Valley tech worker who'd taken a wrong. Something wrong with the car? Joe managed to ask, his voice professionally neutral despite his surprise. Suspension's making noise. Getting worse. Musk ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. Tesla service centers are backed up for weeks. Someone in Fremont mentioned your name, said you might be able. Joe almost laughed. Almost. Tesla was notorious for making life difficult for independent mechanics. No access to parts, proprietary diagnostic tools locked behind expensive licenses, software that could detect and void warranties if anyone but Tesla techs worked on the car. He'd turned away Tesla owners before, explaining that his hands were but curiosity got the better of him. When would he ever get another chance to look under a Tesla, owned by Musk himself? Let me take a look, he heard himself say. No promises. Musk nodded, then stepped back to take a phone call. Joe could hear him arguing with someone about production numbers and deadlines as he prepared to raise the car on. The shop felt different somehow, like the air had gotten thicker. Joe had worked on expensive cars before. Plenty of BMWs and Mercedes came through his doors. But this was the car that had changed the industry, created by the man who turned the automotive world upside. As he positioned the lift arms, Joe thought about Tommy. His son had been obsessed with Tesla, had gone to every product launch he could. This is the future, he'd say, eyes shining with excitement. Electric's gonna change everything. The hydraulics hummed as the Tesla rose in the air. Joe grabbed his inspection light, ready to look for whatever was causing the noise. Just another car, he told himself. Just another. He had no idea that in a few minutes, his whole world would turn upside. But for now, he was just a mechanic doing his job, unaware that fate had finally decided to throw him the biggest curveball. All right, he muttered to himself, clicking on his light. Let's see what we've got here. The undercarriage looked clean, too clean. Most Teslas he'd seen had at least some road grime, but this one was spotless, like it had been detailed. Joe ran his light along the suspension components, listening to Musk's voice fade as he walked further away, still on his. No, that's not acceptable, Musk was saying. We need those chips by next quarter, not. Hold on, he covered the phone. How's it looking down there? Just started, Joe replied, his focus on the task. Gonna need a few minutes. He'd worked on exactly 3 Teslas before, all belonging to customers who didn't mind risking their warranty. The layout was familiar enough. McPherson struts up front, multi-link rear suspension. But something about this one felt different. The shop's radio played faintly in the background, some old Eagles song competing with the whir of the fans. Joe wiped sweat from his forehead with his. The heat was making his shirt stick to his back, but he barely noticed. Years of working in these conditions had made it second. Hey, you got any water? Musk had finished his call and was now looking around the shop with what seemed like genuine mini fridge in the waiting area. Joe pointed. Help yourself. While Musk walked away, Joe continued his inspection. The suspension geometry looked stock at first glance, but something wasn't quite right. He pulled out his phone and Googled the specs for this model year, comparing measurements. Interesting shop you've got here, Musk said, returning with a water bottle. He was studying the certificates on the wall. How long you been in business? 20 years this August. Joe adjusted his light. Started in my garage, saved up for this place. Nothing fancy, but it pays the bills. Most days anyway. Best innovations start in garages, Musk replied, and there was something knowing in his tone. Tesla's first Roadster prototype was built in a garage not much bigger than this. Joe grunted in acknowledgement, his attention caught by something unusual in the rear suspension setup. The control arms had been modified, subtly, but definitely modified. The work was clean, almost factory-looking. Joe's world had shrunk to the size of those 2 small letters stamped into the metal. T.S. Tommy Sullivan. His hands were still shaking as he pulled himself out from under the Tesla, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the heat was making him see things. "Mr. Musk," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. "Where'd you get this car?" Elon was scrolling through his phone, looking distracted. "Bought it used a couple months ago. Good deal. Previous owner was moving overseas or something." He glanced up. "Why? Found the problem?" Joe walked to his office on unsteady legs, aware of Musk's curious gaze following him. The small room felt even smaller now, the walls closing in. He pulled open his desk drawer, pushing aside old receipts and warranty cards until he found what he was looking for, a worn leather notebook. Tommy's notebook. The pages were soft from use, the corners dog-eared. Joe had memorized every sketch, every calculation, every late-night idea his son had scribbled down. But he needed to be sure. He needed proof beyond those 2 letters, stamped in the metal. "Mind if I check something else on the car?" he called out, the notebook clutched in his hand like a lifeline. "Sure, but I've got a meeting in 2 hours. Musk checked his watch. "How bad is the suspension?" Joe didn't answer. He was already back under the Tesla, comparing Tommy's sketches to the modifications above him. The custom control arm design matched perfectly. Every angle, every measurement exactly as Tommy had drawn it. Pages 47-49 of the notebook detailed the entire suspension redesign, including the projected performance improvements. "Hey, Danny," Joe spoke into his phone, trying to keep his voice steady. "Remember that Tesla Tommy worked on, the one that got stolen? You still got those parts receipts in your system?" "Man, that was years ago." Danny hesitated. "Let me check the archives. Give me a few minutes." Joe's mind wandered back to those days while he waited. Tommy had spent months designing the modifications, ordering parts through Danny's store to keep costs down. "It's gonna revolutionize Tesla's suspension system, Dad," he'd said, eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Just wait and see." His phone buzzed. "Found 'em," Danny said. "Custom parts ordered by Tommy Sullivan, March 2018. Want me to read off the numbers?" Joe put the phone on speaker and started checking part numbers. One by one, they matched. The special bushings Tommy had designed, the reinforced control arms, the modified spring rates, everything. "Joe?" Danny's voice was concerned. "What's going on?" "I'll call you back." Joe ended the call, his mind spinning. He needed to think, needed to process what this meant. The local news report from 5 years ago was still available online. He'd read it so many times he could quote it from memory. Local engineering graduate killed in hit-and-run accident. 3 days after the Tesla was stolen. 3 days that had changed everything. Found something interesting? Musk was leaning against a toolbox now, still looking at his phone, but clearly aware that something was up. Joe straightened up, wiping his hands mechanically on his shop rag. The familiar motion helped ground him. "You said you bought it used? Mind if I ask from who?" "Some tech executive, Jeremy something. Said he got it at an auction." Musk shrugged. "Paperwork all checked out." "Why?" "Because this car was stolen 5 years ago." Joe's voice was surprisingly calm. "From my driveway, 3 days before my son was killed." That got Musk's full attention. He lowered his phone, really looking at Joe for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Joe opened Tommy's notebook to the suspension designs. "My son, Tommy, fresh out of Caltech, engineering degree, brilliant kid," his voice caught. "He modified this Tesla, improved the suspension design. These are his drawings, his calculations, his work." He handed the notebook to Musk, who took it with visible interest. "These modifications, they're actually quite impressive." He flipped through the pages, his expression changing from skepticism to genuine curiosity. "The camber adjustment mechanism is elegant, simple but effective." Yeah, that was Tommy, always finding the elegant solution. Joe ran a hand through his gray hair. He was going to patent the design, had a meeting scheduled with a patent attorney. Then the car disappeared. Police never found it. The shop felt too quiet now. The fans hummed in the background, pushing around hot air that seemed to stick in Joe's lungs. On the radio, some commercial was playing, the cheerful jingle jarringly out of place. 3 days later, Joe continued, each word heavy with memory. Tommy was walking home from the bus stop. Drunk driver ran a red light, didn't even stop. He closed his eyes, fighting back the familiar pain. They caught the guy eventually. But Tommy was gone. Musk set the notebook down carefully on the workbench. I'm sorry about your son. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he was typing something into it. Let me make some calls. Find out where this car really came from. Joe barely heard him. He was lost in memories. Tommy working late in the garage, music playing, tools scattered everywhere. The pride in his voice when the test drive showed his modifications had worked better than expected. The empty driveway that morning, the police questions, the funeral, the suspension design. Musk's voice cut through his thoughts. Your son developed this independently? Yeah. Spent months on it. Said the stock Tesla suspension was good, but could be better. Joe picked up the notebook, thumbing through the familiar pages. He figured out how to improve the handling without compromising ride quality. Tested everything himself. These calculations. Musk was looking at photos he'd taken of the notebook pages. They're thorough, professional level work. Tommy was brilliant. Joe's voice cracked slightly. Could have worked anywhere he wanted. SpaceX, NASA, you name it. But he loved working with his hands. Said theory was nothing without practical application. The sound of another car pulling into the lot made them both look up. Mr. Chen had arrived for his oil change, right on time. Give me a minute, Joe called out to him. Running a bit behind today. No rush, the elderly man replied, settling into a waiting room chair with a newspaper. Joe turned back to Musk. The suspension noise you're hearing? It's because the rear bushings need replacement. Tommy's notes mentioned they'd need servicing around 50,000 miles. He managed a weak smile. Kid thought of everything. Musk was typing rapidly on his phone. I'm having our legal team trace this car's history. If it was stolen, we'll find out how it ended up at auction. He paused. These suspension modifications. Would you be willing to share your son's designs with our engineering team? The question hit Joe like a physical blow. Tommy's designs, the ones he'd been so excited about, the ones he'd never had a chance to patent, to develop further, to see realized. I don't know, he said honestly. I need some time to think. Of course. Musk handed him a business card. When you're ready, call this number. Ask for Sarah in engineering. She'll set everything up. He glanced at the notebook. Your son's work shouldn't be lost. It deserves to be developed, to help people. I think that's what he would have wanted. Joe's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, turning away to compose himself. The card in his hand felt impossibly. The suspension noise, he said finally, his voice rough. I can fix it. Have the parts in stock. Tommy's specs, so I know they'll do it. Musk nodded. Whatever it needs. He hesitated, then added, I'm sorry about your son, Mr. Sullivan. Truly. Let us make this. As Joe gathered the parts he needed, his hands steady now with the familiar work ahead, he thought about Tommy. About dreams cut short. About legacy. About chance encounters that changed everything. The Tesla sat on his lift. No longer just another job. It was a piece of Tommy, found after all these years. A final gift from a son to his father. A bridge between what was lost and what might still. Joe picked up his tools, ready to work on his son's design one more time. Some repairs, he was learning, fixed more than just. Mr. Chen would have to wait a little longer for his oil change. Right now, Joe had more important work. He reached for his socket set, the familiar weight of the tools grounding him in reality. The Tesla's suspension components were right there above him, each piece telling a story he knew by heart. Your design really was brilliant, kid, he whispered, his fingers tracing the modified control arm. The shop's background noise faded away. The hum of fans, Chen's rustling newspaper, the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. All that existed was the car and Tommy's. Need any help? Musk asked, watching Joe prep for the No, Joe's response was automatic. This was between him and Tommy's legacy. But you might want to grab a chair. This'll take about an hour. As he worked, memories flooded back. Tommy explaining each modification, his hands gesturing excitedly as he walked Joe through the improvements. The late-night calculations spread across their kitchen. The test drives. Tommy grinning as the car hugged each corner per. Hey, Mr. Musk's voice cut through his thoughts. Our legal team found something. The car was sold at a police auction in Sacramento 3 years ago. They're tracking down the paper trail. Joe didn't sleep that night. How could he? Tommy's notebook lay open on his kitchen table. Pages worn smooth from years of touch, diagrams and calculations, a testament to dreams cut short. The bottle of whiskey stayed unopened. He needed a clear head for what was coming. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Sarah from Tesla Engineering. Mr. Musk asked me to look into your son's designs immediately. Can you come to our Fremont facility tomorrow, 9 a.m.? Joe stared at the message until his eyes burned. Tomorrow. Today, really. His regular customers would understand. They always did when he needed to close the shop unexpectedly. Most had been around 5 years ago. When? He texted back one word. Yes. The drive to Fremont felt surreal in the early morning light. Joe had made this trip dozens of times for parts runs, but never in his best shirt, never with Tommy's notebook riding shotgun, never with this mix of hope and dread churning in his stomach. The Tesla facility was massive, all glass and steel rising from the California landscape. Joe parked his old Ford pickup between sleek electric cars, feeling out of place. At the security desk, a young woman was already waiting. "Mr. Sullivan? I'm Sarah Chen." She extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." She looked young, Tommy's age maybe. Her Tesla employee badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights as she led him through a maze of corridors. "We were up all night reviewing the photos Mr. Musk sent," she said, swiping her badge at another security door. "Your son's work, it's remarkable. The way he solved the damping issues, especially at high speeds. We've been working on similar solutions for months." Joe clutched the notebook tighter. Tommy always saw things differently. Said sometimes you had to step back to see the whole picture. The engineering lab was huge, filled with computers and testing equipment. Several people looked up as they entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else. Respect, maybe. Joe. Elon Musk stood from a conference table covered in technical drawings. "Thank you for coming. We've got something to show you." On a large screen, 3D models rotated slowly. Tommy's suspension design, rendered in precise detail. Next to it, performance graphs showed exactly what Joe remembered from those test drives. Improved handling, better stability, reduced wear. "We ran simulations all night," Sarah explained, pulling up more data. "Your son's design outperforms our current system by 17% in key metrics. The simplicity of it, it's elegant." "That was Tommy," Joe said softly. "Always found the simple solution where everyone else went complex." A older man at the table cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm James Morton, Tesla's chief patent counsel. We'd like to discuss your son's intellectual property rights." Joe's hands tightened on the notebook. His designs were never patented. The car was stolen before, but they were documented. Morton interrupted, gesturing to the notebook. "And you, as his next of kin, inherit those rights. We'd like to make an offer." The room felt too small suddenly. Joe looked at the screen, at Tommy's work brought to life in gleaming digital precision. Then at the faces around the table, engineers, lawyers, executives, all waiting for his response. "Before we discuss anything," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I want to know about the car. How did my son's stolen Tesla end up being sold to Elon Musk?" The room grew quiet. Musk nodded to someone, and a document appeared on the screen. "Sacramento Police Auction, 2020, Sarah began. "The car was found during a drug bust in Stockton. No connection to the original theft was made because it was out of Oakland PD's jurisdiction?" Joe finished. "Yeah, I figured that part out." Morton shuffled some papers. "Mr. Sullivan, about the patent rights." "No." Joe's voice was firm. "First, I want to tell you about my son, about who he was, what these designs meant to him." He opened the notebook, hands steady now. Tommy wasn't just creating a better suspension. He was trying to change how people thought about engineering. For the next hour, Joe walked them through Tommy's journey. The late-night breakthroughs, the failed attempts, the persistence, the joy when it finally worked. His voice broke only once, describing the morning they found the driveway empty. "He was going to change the world," Joe said finally. That's what he always said. "Dad, we're gonna change the world." Sarah wiped her eyes quickly. trying to be professional. Even Musk looked moved, his usual intensity softened. "Mr. Sullivan," Musk said, "we'd like to honor your son's work. Not just buy the patents, but create something lasting, a foundation maybe. Scholarships for young engineers who think differently. And we want you involved. Your experience, your understanding of Tommy's work, it's invaluable." Joe looked at the screen again, at Tommy's designs rotating slowly in blue light. "He would have loved this," he said quietly. "Being here, seeing his work understood, appreciated." Morton started to speak, but Musk held up a hand. "Take your time, Joe. This is about more than patents and contracts. This is about legacy." Joe nodded, touching the notebook gently. "Tommy used to say that every problem had a solution. You just had to be patient enough to find it." He looked around the room at the eager faces of engineers who saw the brilliance in his son's work. "Maybe this is the solution we've been waiting for." Sarah stepped forward, pointing to a detail in the design. "We'd like to start testing immediately. With your permission, we can have a prototype ready in weeks, and we'd like you to be part of the process." "Testing?" Joe's voice caught. "You mean building it exactly like he designed it?" "Better," Musk said. "Taking his vision and making it reality. On every Tesla we make." The sun was climbing higher outside, casting long shadows through the lab's windows. Somewhere in the facility, machines were humming, engineers were working, the future was being built. And now, maybe, Tommy would be part of that future. Joe opened the notebook one more time, touching the pages his son had filled with dreams. Then he looked up, his decision made. "Tell me everything you want to know about these designs," he said. "Let me show you how my boy was going to change the world." The room burst into activity. Engineers gathered around, questions flowing. Sarah started organizing teams for prototyping. Morton began drafting agreements. But Joe barely noticed. He was lost in memory, hearing Tommy's voice. "Trust me, Dad. This is going to be something special." And finally, after 5 long years, it was. The next few hours passed in a blur of technical discussions. Joe found himself at a whiteboard, explaining Tommy's thought process, the subtle refinements that made the design special. Engineers crowded around, asking questions that Tommy would have loved to answer. "The genius is in the progressive rate change," Sarah noted, studying one of Tommy's diagrams. "It adapts to load automatically." That was his breakthrough moment, Joe remembered, pointing to a late-night calculation in the notebook. 3 a.m. He woke me up shouting about variable load distribution. Couldn't wait till morning to show me. Musk had been quiet for a while, studying everything intently. Now he spoke up. "We need to move fast on this, not just for business reasons." He looked at Joe. "This design needs to carry your son's name. The world should know who created it." The words hit Joe hard. Tommy's name, his legacy, not forgotten, not lost to a senseless accident, but alive in every car that would carry his innovation. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling up a new document on the screen. "We found the person who bought your son's car at auction, the one who sold it to Mr. Musk." Joe's heart skipped. "Who?" "Jeremy Caldwell, Silicon Valley venture capitalist." She displayed a photo. "He claims he had no idea the car was stolen." "Can we track back further?" Joe asked. "Find out who stole it in the first place?" Morton, the patent lawyer, cleared his throat. "Police records from the drug bust might help. We have our security team looking into it." "Mr. Sullivan," Musk interjected, "I know finding the thief is important, but right now, let's focus on your son's legacy, on making his work mean something." Joe stared at the whiteboard, at Tommy's equations rendered in his own handwriting. His son had always said that dwelling on the past didn't solve problems, moving forward did. "You're right," he said finally. "Tommy would want us focusing on the future, not the past." Sarah gathered the engineering team, starting to assign tasks. "We'll need prototypes, test data, certification processes." "I want to be involved," Joe said firmly. "Every step. These aren't just designs on paper, they're my son's dreams." "Of course," Musk nodded. "We'll set up a consulting agreement. Your experience with the original implementation is invaluable." As the day wound down, Joe found himself back in the parking lot, the afternoon sun making his old pickup truck look even more out of place among the Teslas. Sarah walked him out, carrying a stack of preliminary agreements for him to review. "We'll start first thing Monday," she said. "I can't tell you how excited the team is about this." Joe nodded, his throat tight. "Tommy would have loved working with you all. This was his dream, being part of something bigger." "He still is," she smiled. "We'll make sure of that." Driving home, Joe took the long way, past Tommy's old high school, past the garage where they'd first installed the modified suspension. The city had changed in 5 years, but the memories were still sharp as ever. He parked in his driveway, in the same spot where Tommy's Tesla had been stolen. But tonight, the empty space didn't feel like a wound anymore. Inside, he placed Tommy's notebook on the kitchen table, the same table where his son had spread out calculations, dreaming of changing the automotive world. Now those dreams were going to come true, just not the way anyone had expected. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Team's already starting on prototype designs. Your son's work is going to change everything." Joe smiled through tears, remembering Tommy's words from years ago. "Trust me, Dad. This is going to be something special." And now, finally, the world would get to see just how special it was. 3 months passed, in a blur of prototypes, test drives, and endless meetings. Joe's repair shop now operated on reduced hours, with Mike handling most of the day-to-day work, while Joe split his time between Oakland and Tesla's Fremont facility. "How's the testing going?" Mike asked one morning, watching Joe gather his tools. The shop felt different now. A Tesla poster hung on the wall, right next to Tommy's old college photo. "Final phase," Joe replied, checking his phone for messages from Sarah. "Production models start next month." The phone buzzed. Another text from Sarah. "Big announcement today. Wear something nice." Joe smiled, remembering Tommy's hatred of formal clothes. "Dad, you can't innovate in a tie," he used to say. But today was different. The Tesla facility had become familiar over the past months. Security guards nodded as he parked his pickup, now sporting a Tesla employee badge on the dashboard. Engineers waved as he walked through the labs where Tommy's suspension design had gone from notebook sketches to reality. Sarah met him at the conference room door, practically bouncing with excitement. "Ready for this?" "As I'll ever be." Joe straightened his tie, the same one he'd worn to Tommy's graduation. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, and Tesla executives. Elon Musk stood at the podium, waiting for the room to settle. "Today," Musk began, "Tesla is announcing a revolutionary advancement in vehicle suspension technology. But this isn't just about innovation. It's about legacy, about dreams that refuse to die, and about a young engineer named Thomas Sullivan." The screen behind him lit up with Tommy's photo, the same one from Joe's shop. Professional, smiling, full of promise. 5 years ago, Tommy Sullivan created something extraordinary in his father's garage. Today, that creation becomes part of every Tesla we produce. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Sullivan Adaptive Suspension System. The room erupted in camera flashes as technical specifications appeared on screen. Joe barely heard the technical details Musk was sharing. His eyes were fixed on Tommy's photo, on his son's name in large letters above performance graphs and patent numbers. "And now," Musk continued, "I'd like to introduce someone special. The man who preserved this innovation, who helped us bring it to life. Joe Sullivan, Tommy's father." Joe walked to the podium on shaky legs. The speech they'd prepared sat in his pocket, untouched. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "My son Tommy was a dreamer," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "He believed that great innovations don't always come from big labs or billion-dollar companies. Sometimes they come from a kid in his dad's garage, staying up late because he can't stop thinking about making things better." The room was silent now, cameras forgotten. "Tommy used to tell me, 'Dad, we're gonna change the world.' He didn't get to see it happen the way he planned. But today, his dream comes true. Every Tesla that leaves this factory will carry a piece of him, will be better because of what he created." Joe pulled something from his pocket, a worn steel component from the original prototype. "This is from the first suspension system Tommy built. It's been in my toolbox for 5 years. Today, it goes where it belongs, in the Tesla Museum, alongside other innovations that changed automotive history." Later, after the presentations and interviews, Joe found himself in the parking lot with Sarah and Musk. "There's one more thing," Musk said, gesturing to a covered car nearby. "The first production model with the Sullivan system. We thought you should have it." The cover came off, revealing a Tesla Model S in deep blue, Tommy's favorite color. On the rear quarter panel, a small badge read, "Sullivan's Suspension Technology." Tommy would say it's too flashy. Joe laughed through tears. "Oh, that's not all." Sarah grinned. "Show him the other thing." Musk handed Joe an envelope. Inside was a scholarship announcement. The Thomas Sullivan Engineering Innovation Fund, supporting garage dreamers who dare to change the world. "Full-ride scholarships for 10 engineering students a year," Sarah explained. "Kids like Tommy, who see solutions others miss." Joe stood there, the paper trembling in his hands, looking at the car that carried his son's name. The journey from that terrible night 5 years ago to this moment felt impossible. Yet here they were. His phone buzzed. A text from Mike. "You gotta see this. News is going crazy. Tommy's trending." Back at the shop that evening, Joe parked the blue Tesla where Tommy's stolen car had once stood. The garage looked the same: tools on the wall, oil stains on the concrete, memories in every corner. But now there was something new. Hope, legacy, purpose. Martha, his old customer, knocked on the garage door. "Saw you on the news," she said, smiling through tears. "Tommy would be so proud." "Yeah," Joe replied, touching the Sullivan badge on the car. That night, Joe sat in his kitchen with Tommy's notebook and a glass of whiskey. But this time, it wasn't to mourn. On the TV, news channels were running stories about the garage genius, whose design was revolutionizing Tesla. Social media was full of young engineers inspired by Tommy's story. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Old friends, customers, even Tommy's college professors reaching out. But the message that hit hardest was from Sarah. "Just had 3 interns ask if they could work on Sullivan's system optimizations. Your son's already inspiring the next generation." Joe opened the notebook one last time, running his fingers over the worn pages. Tommy's calculations, sketches, and notes, once just dreams on paper, were now reality. "We did it, kid," he whispered. "We changed the world." The Sullivan badge on his new Tesla caught the evening light, throwing a reflection on the garage wall, in the same spot where Tommy used to project his designs, planning out the future that had finally arrived. Just not the way anyone. Joe closed the notebook, but not with sadness this time. Tommy's story wasn't ending. It was just in every Tesla that left the factory, in every student who would receive his scholarship, in every young dreamer who heard about the mechanic's son, who revolutionized an industry from his dad's garage. Some legacies, Joe realized, were built in moments of triumph. But Tommy's was built in quiet moments, in a father's love, in a refusal to let a dream. And now, that legacy would live on, 1 mile at a time, in every car that carried his. The epilogue. The Sullivan Auto Repair sign had a fresh coat of paint, and underneath it, new lettering read, "Home of the Sullivan Suspension System." Inside, Joe's old office had transformed. Tommy's engineering diploma now hung beside the Tesla certification, and a glass case displayed the original prototype part. "Mr. Sullivan?" A young woman in a Caltech sweatshirt stood in the doorway. "I'm Jenny Chen, one of the Sullivan Scholarship recipients. I was hoping to see where it all started." This had become common: engineering students making pilgrimages to the garage where Tommy had created his. Joe welcomed them all, sharing the story, showing them the workbench where Tommy had spent countless nights. "He used to work right here," Joe said, patting the worn wooden surface. "Said he could think better with tools in his hands." Jenny ran her fingers over the bench reverently. "They're teaching us about his design and advanced vehicle dynamics. Professor Martinez says it's revolutionized how we think about adaptive suspension systems." The shop still did regular repairs. Joe insisted on that. But now there was a waiting list of Tesla owners specifically requesting his. The blue Model S, with the first production Sullivan system, sat in a special bay, a reminder of how far they. Sarah called every week with updates. The Sullivan system was exceeding all performance metrics. Tesla's competitors were scrambling, and the scholarship fund had grown, now supporting 15 students instead of. "Tommy would have loved teaching these kids," Joe told Mike one evening, watching another young engineer examine the prototype display. showing them that innovation doesn't care where you come. The story had taken on a life of its own. The Garage Genius documentary was in production, telling Tommy's story to inspire other young innovators. Joe had insisted that part of the proceeds go to the scholarship, but his favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Working late in the garage, feeling Tommy's presence in every tool, every oil stain, every dream that had started right. "You were right, kid," he'd whisper sometimes. "You really did change the world." And somewhere, he knew, Tommy was